With her law degree and a passion for film industry, she moved to Los Angeles with a Fulbright Scholarship, hoping to go back despite her dad's last-minute shocking advice. 10 years later, she's an independent film producer and writer of several documentaries, like Oleg, I Clown You, No Crime, No Punishment, and No Love in the City, and a podcaster on immigrant stories. In this episode, not only she talks about her journey and why she covers immigrant stories, but also how the idea of I Clown You emerged, which is a documentary about the fascinating role of medical clowns in Israel's hospitals. So go ahead, grab your cup of tea, and join me in this episode of Empowering Conversations. Hello and welcome to the Empowering Conversations podcast, a place to get inspired, challenged, and empowered by stories of immigrants who build their success from zero. I'm your host, Mehran.
I was born and raised in Moscow, Russia. I grew up in non-existent middle class. I went to law school. Originally, that was the big plan, big hope. I had all those idealistic ideas about bringing justice and fairness and protecting people. And then by the end of my law school, I came to realize that I cannot be a lawyer in a system beyond law. And it was funny because my first job was as an attorney's assistant that I took second year of law school. And the guy who I was working for, who I'm still friends with, he said, after interviewing me, okay, you got the job, but you have to realize that you're going to work for me for a year and then you're going to quit the profession. And I was so young and passionate about being a lawyer at the time. I didn't believe him, but that's exactly what ended up happening. I was exposed to all the corruption and failures of the system that I would have to deal with, that I pretty much, by the third year of law school, I realized that I will not be able to be a professional in that field. And then I still kind of had the hope of, okay, maybe I can be like a human rights person or something like that. And then around that time, mid-2000s, there were a series of assassinations of journalists and human rights activists in Russia. And I came to realize, which was kind of disappointing for me, that I don't have it in me to go to prison or to risk my life for a cause. And so I had to accept that I will not be a lawyer. And that was the first time I changed directions drastically. And so at the time I was excited about, there was a lot of growth in film industry in Russia, and I was excited and interested in that. And so I started working in film. A few years later, I was very fortunate. I got a scholarship, a Fulbright Scholarship, to come to study in America. And the night before I was leaving, my dad sat me down. He tells me, "Don't come back." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? I just signed a contract with American Department of State that is sponsoring my scholarship, that I am supposed to come back to Russia after my school. That's the only obligation I have." And I was talking to my dad, and you brought me up believing that this is Russia, this is our country, this is where we're going to make things better. And you didn't leave yourself when you had a chance in the 90s, and you were this young Jewish programmer. Why didn't you leave? And that's when he said, if I knew then what I know now, I would have left. I still didn't want to emigrate from Russia, leave Russia. I never wanted to be an immigrant because I knew how I didn't know really, but I had kind of an inkling that it was not as rosy of a path. And I had a pretty good life in Russia. I had good education, I had connections, I had a social network, I had great friends, I had family. I had no actual reason to leave. And so I told my dad, okay, I'll think about it. And I got on a plane and came here to Los Angeles 10 years ago to study. And then life happened. Within half a year, I met my husband. And when we met, one of the first things were getting serious quickly. And one of the first things I told him, I was like, listen, this is going great and this is all good, but I don't want to live here. I want to live in Russia. I want my children to speak Russian. I don't like it here and I'm going back. And he said, well, if that's what's important to you, when we get there, we'll go to Russia. And I was like, oh, you're so sweet. You have no idea. And turns out that it's me who had no idea, because in the end, what happened was after a few years, things in Russia took a turn that made my whole idea of bicontinental career and being the citizen of the world and making film projects everywhere kind of, well, not necessarily impossible, because I know people who do that, but much more complicated. Let's put it this way. I mean, definitely in the beginning, I had no intention of staying. I was like, all right, I'm going to, go to school, maybe work a little bit, maybe work for a couple of years. We'll see what happens. And then I'll go and do my stuff elsewhere. And so I didn't necessarily think so strategically of paving the way for my career here or arranging and putting things in order to have a start here. And part of it was that my visa situation didn't really allow that, because there were certain limitations on the kinds of work that I was allowed to do, even before I was on a journalist visa. When I was on this post-graduation training, there was only very specific kinds of work that were allowed. Had to do with my degree, had to be on site, had to be a certain level of income. Like, it was very strict. And in film industry, it's rare. so I was limited there. And then when I was on journalist visa again, I was very limited, and I was unsure that anything will happen, because it's such a rare situation where Department of State does issue those exemptions for Fulbright students, that lawyer told us right away, there's no statistics. Even when you ask them, like, what are my chances? And he's like, exceptional. And that was not very promising. And that definitely set me back, both in career and just emotionally.
Absolutely.
And then when that moment came, when I got the card and I looked at that card and I was like, oh, now I'm an immigrant. And there was a certain level of resolution in that moment where, yeah, I could still say that I'm a citizen of the world, whatever. I'm a citizen of two countries, a resident of the third, and I can travel. And I still did actually do projects in Russia and in Israel, but it kind of dawned on me that if I want to build something, and if I want to have family specifically, I do have to commit to this place. And I have to think of it as the main place. And I remember that was not a comfortable idea. And I called my mother-in-law, who is British, my husband's mom, and she's been living in the US for like many years, since the 70s, I think. And And I called her and I was like, Lynn, so how long did it take you to kind of feel that this is home? And she's just, without missing a beat, she goes, oh, never. I still can't believe my children speak with American accent.
That helps.
And I was like, oh, at least that had it's an answer. And I'm actually very grateful to her because she's very direct that way, but not in a mean way or anything. But she always says that I am American and I am British. And so she kind of started that process for me of finding this merged identity where you're not one thing rejecting the other. You are both. Because I don't know how it was for you and how it is in Iran, but in Russia, there's definitely this sense of, I guess, left over from the Soviet times. Not so bad as it used to be. When you left Soviet Union, you were considered a traitor, but there is kind of left over of that. So when you leave, you kind of lose part of your right to call yourself Russian for Russians.
I resonated with Sasha as I too was raised with this sense of pride for my country, for my people, and for my culture. And I know many of you feel the same way too. Many of us are raised with this sense of pride for our place of birth. And to accept a new home, a new culture, and our emerging identities, we face challenges. But as Dr. D, founder of Miracle Babies, said it on the first episode, quote, we have to remind ourselves it is only our thoughts that hinder us from moving forward. We are all very much alike. More than 99% of our DNA is the same. If you can see beyond the superficial barriers, the top layer of epidermis, then you can certainly achieve a lot more. Unquote. Coaching tip. Embrace the new home, the new culture. Let new experiences open new doors of opportunity and connection.
You told us already about some of the challenges that you faced, especially when the green card, was in your hands. What else? What else was there early on? What were some of the challenges that you faced?
Well, the biggest thing is, and I talk a lot about this with other immigrants, is that thing that you take for granted back home is the network, is the connections. And it's not just about friends, because that was the easier part for me, because I married my husband and I got a whole circle of people through him. And then over time, I built my own circle. It actually took me many years to find the right Russians, because, people sometimes assume like, oh, you're going to be friends with all the Russians. But no, I wouldn't be friends with any Russian in Russia. Why would I be friends with just any Russian here just because they're Russian? No, they have to be my kind of Russian. And that layer is rather thin even there. And here it's even thinner because there's just less of us here. And I don't mean to sound elitist. It's just more about, the background that we come from, the books that we've read, the way we think of the world. So that took a while. But then simple things like finding a job in Russia, I can call 10 people. Within a week, I'm going to have some kind of offer. And within a couple months, I'm going to have actually something that I will be interested in, maybe even faster. And here, I didn't have any of that. And there is this mistrust. It's harder to come in without a recommendation, because somebody looks at your resume and you have foreign education. I went to college back in Russia, and the foreign name, and people, even though I have some experience, people look at it and they think, oh, well, I don't know what her language skills are. I don't know what her cultural assimilation level is. Like, how much does she understand what's going on here? I don't want to deal with it. In my field specifically, I can imagine that in like IT, the transition is different and it's easier because they speak their own language of programming, and it's universal in a way. And for me, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a content creator, whatever that means. Cultural context is the language, and acquiring that cultural context. And actually, that was probably the biggest reason I did not want to be an immigrant, is that I knew that I will never reach the level of understanding the cultural context in a way that somebody who grew up here and read the children's books here and listened to, Nirvana in the 90s here. I will never have that. It took me a long time to accept that my experience as an immigrant actually is part of the American experience. And that's what I'm trying to work with and talk about and support people through, is helping people realize that it is a valid experience. And over time, you do learn things here and there. You watch movies with the people. After time, if you put in the time and effort into learning about American culture, you do get to understand it better. And even though you will not understand it as an American person who grew up here, you get to a place where you're comfortable.
Mm. So how long did it take you to build that comfort in the film industry?
I think I'm just getting there. 10 years
So
in.
it takes long, persistent time.
Yeah. And also you grow into it. So by now, I have been here for these 10 years and I've lived it. And while I'm looking and learning about things that happened before, like I love stand-up comedy, for example. That was one of the biggest, if we talk about gains and something that I got out of coming here, that was the biggest thing for me culturally, discovering that genre, because it doesn't really, now it actually, in the last 10 years, actually it developed in Russia. But when I was living there, we didn't have stand-up comedians. We had these guys, they were called humorists, but they would usually read off the page, and they would read like kind of humorous stories, similar but not the same feel. And so when I came here, I was really excited about this genre. I even did open mics for a brief period of time. And now I'm thinking about it and I'm like, oh my God, 5 years ago, what kind of jokes was I making? How people were like sitting through that. As I'm living these 10 years here, I got to see a lot of new comedians come out, and I'm watching that scene develop, and I'm also studying about what happened. So it accumulates, but it takes a very long time.
And then you've been in the film industry for how long before you decided to take a step back?
Well, I'm still in the industry. I just worked on, for 2 years, I worked on this documentary project. I served as an associate producer, and I did research and consulted on the matters of Russian and Soviet history. This documentary called Oleg, that will hopefully come out this year, about a Soviet immigrant, Oleg Vidov, who some Russians might know, but older generation, but not younger generation. He was this superstar in Soviet Union in the 70s. He was kind of the Robert Redford of Soviet Union, and he was this heartthrob. And I'm not going to get too deep into it, but through the number of events and years, he ended up being blacklisted, and pretty much his career was ruined, and he had to leave the Soviet Union. He made the decision to leave, which at the time was very difficult. And he defected from Soviet Union through Yugoslavia, through Europe. And he ended up here in Los Angeles, and he was married to Joan Borsten Vidoff, American journalist. And he had this whole second chapter of his life here. So I'm still in the film. But for many years, I have loved radio. Actually, since I was a child, since a very young age, my favorite radio station in Russia was Echo of Moscow, that is still around, and I still listen to it.
You still listen?
I still listen on the internet. Thank gods of the ether for the internet. Another amazing discovery coming here was American radio and podcasting. I thought of myself just as a filmmaker for the most part. And so after a while, I started thinking, oh, maybe it would be cool to get a podcast going. And that was probably 5 years ago, but I was busy with other projects and didn't really think of it as in a focused way. And then I started developing my podcast 2 years ago, more or less, and I launched it a little over half a year ago. And I'm thinking and I'm looking right now, the project, the documentary project that I was on ended, and it ended in the middle of pandemic, which was not very convenient.
Yeah, it was a difficult time.
Yeah, but I'm not complaining. I mean, I'm okay. That gave me actually time and opportunity to launch my podcast, and gave me opportunity to work on it in a more focused way that I didn't have while I had a full-time job. So in a way, I have to be grateful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though it would have been much more comfortable to just find a job at some radio station or podcast and be a little more safe. But, you know.
And you have your podcast is about immigrants. So
Yes, that's how we met
I know.
on the Instagram.
As we talked the other day, you mentioned there were few reasons that you were passionate about sharing immigrant stories.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that and allowing me to talk about it, because I don't usually talk about it on my podcast. I did originally come up with the idea of doing a podcast about immigration sometime around 2016, around the time when former president was running, and there was this major uptick in anti-immigrant sentiments. And it was incredibly insulting that people were so disrespectful and diminishing. And I wanted to do something, but as I've mentioned, I was busy with another project and I kind of put it aside. But I had this idea, and the original title was supposed to be Understanding Aliens. In that title, I wanted people who are here to understand us. As I was working on developing, after a couple of years, I started actually developing it. I came to realize that people who are from here don't really care to understand us. And it's not a bad thing, and you cannot really hold it against them. Because there are some, but maybe 5% of them, maybe 10% of them are actually curious. And they will meet you as a person, and they will be nice to you, but they won't go out to listen to a whole podcast of your stories as immigrants. It's not that vital to them. And so I came to realize that the podcast has to be for immigrants. And that's when I realized that there is this whole part of supporting each other through hearing each other's stories. And there's so many, but most of us, and from the questions that you're asking, I know that you've been going through some of the things that are similar, but in your own way. And some of them resonate. And when you hear that others go through that, that helps. It's that simple. It helps to know that, first of all, you're not alone and you didn't mess it up, and there's nothing wrong with you feeling that way. And also that there is a light at the end of that tunnel, and you will not always feel disenfranchised and like you don't belong. Over time, and as you find people and as you grow your new identity, it will change, and that helps. And so that was kind of the step 2 of the evolution, and the reason number 2, right? And then as I was already, after I launched, as I'm working on the podcast, I realized that I kind of went a little bit back to the original idea of, I want to highlight the contributions of immigrants. I want to show stories of people who came here and created something of huge value, because it's inspiring for people who come here to hear that our community, the immigrant community, creates a lot of things, and we do. And it's also, if somebody who's not an immigrant and who they go and they look at the list of people and they look at what these people have done and created, maybe they will think next time, they will think twice before being disrespectful or diminishing immigrants. I mean, I do think that in the course of this pandemic, to a degree, the sentiment has changed, because there is this very clear, obvious thing that we see, that the majority of essential workers are people of color, and a lot of them are immigrants or children of immigrants. And they have made life possible by their work that was essential, working in hospitals, working in the fields, working in the food manufacturing and production, working at the stores. And also, we have this new president now, so there's a major change in tone. So I think that, again, if there's a silver lining to all of this, maybe that's it.
Absolutely. And then also the 2 major companies that are working on, that they finished making the COVID-19 vaccine, are both founded by immigrants. So, I mean, that by itself speaks, to the magnitude of our contribution.
Studies show 1 out of 6 healthcare workers are immigrants. And as Clientas, founder of 4 biotech companies, pointed out on our 10th episode, 2/3 of biotech companies are founded by immigrants alone. And as I mentioned repeatedly throughout this episode, over 40% of Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 companies are founded by immigrants and their children. If these are not testaments to our qualities, then I don't know what could be. So if you ever feel discriminated, suppressed, or limited because of your color, your race, your name, your culture, your language, know you have a lot more to offer. This country needs the best of all of us to heal. And if you need a little more assurance, you can hop on my friend's podcast, We the Aliens podcast, to hear more stories of achievement and success by immigrants. Coaching tip. While you need to be proud of your qualities, keep learning. Keep sharpening your communication skills. We immigrants can easily be misunderstood. Make sure you listen to Clientas' 10th episode and how he was misunderstood many times as a CEO.
There's another project that you are working on. And I have to say, when I listened to that TED Talk,
Mm. Oh.
it
Oh, you went
felt
deep.
heartwarming. I had goosebumps. I had tears. It was amazing. Tell me about the I Clown You project that you are working on, your pet
Yeah,
project.
it's my baby. I Clown You is a documentary about clowns who work in hospitals in Israel. It's a fascinating thing because actually in Israel, it is a profession. They have this whole organization there that helps to put clowns to work as part of hospital staff. They're not there just to cheer up and make balloons. They are part of procedures. They're part of protocols in the hospital. Israel is a very diverse society. It is a society full of conflicts, and there is political, religious, language issues, and all of that one would think would tear the country apart, but somehow they're keeping it together. And then hospital is this one of the few places where all the communities happen to be together. They don't come there willingly, but they do have to share that space. And they find a way to do that. And in that sense, I was always looking at the hospital as a place of hope, because when a Jewish doctor is tending to Arabic pregnant woman, or when an Arabic nurse is treating a Jewish elderly man, they don't look at their status, they don't look at their religion. They try to speak their language, and they try to just help them on a human level and support them. And to me, that is the seed of hope. When people can put unimportant differences aside, and people stick to the statuses, people stick to their identities, but really, when it comes down to it, what is of utmost importance is the humanity. And hospital has that humanity. And then my friend, who's my partner on this film, who's my friend from college who lives in Israel now, she actually went to the hospital to look for stories, and she ran into the clowns. And when she told me, I met clowns at the hospital, I told her right away, that's it. That's it. That's our story. It's one of those moments in life where you remember where you stood in the room and how the light was falling, and you're like, that was the moment. I knew that was going to be our story. It was an intuitive reaction, but I came to realize that it had so much depth in it. That role of clown, who actually is the one who is this joker, who is unafraid to cross the line between what's appropriate and what's not, cross the line between what's right to say to this person because they're of that religion. And they mess with everybody equally. And they know exactly how to do it in such a way where it's not offensive, but empowering. Yeah, I'm still working on this project. It did run into a typical situation with most independent documentary projects. The funding is hard to come by, but specifically in the last few years, ever since 2016, actually, a lot of donors would tell me, yeah, we'll love your thing, but we're focusing everything on our donations towards ACLU and Planned Parenthood. And I can't compete with that. And I can't tell anyone, yeah, no, give me the money. And I understand. And so it's been a process, but we'll get there.
And I really hope that it goes through, because what the clowns did was magnificent.
Yeah. Well, that's one of those themes that are dear to me for many reasons, is the theme of loss and the theme of grief. And nobody's spared from loss and grief in life. That's part of a human experience. But those are such taboo subjects. And it's interesting because there's an element of loss and grief in the immigrant experience also. And like you, I was, of course, impressed with Clown's ability to tackle it. I have been inspired by these guys as I was going through some of the rough times. One of the takeaways, and I don't think I mentioned that one in my TED Talk. One of the clowns, David Barashi, one of my main characters, told me somebody was preventing me from filming, and it was a problem. I remember David told me, you know what? Always create a positive dynamic. And I live by that. It's always hard. You cannot always do it in a major way, but you can always do it in your mind.
And now, any book recommendation for us?
If I were to recommend a Russian book, of course, there's the famous Archipelago Gulag by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, about the stories from the camps in Soviet Union, for anybody who thinks that communism is not such a bad idea. But if somebody were to look for a fun Russian novel, I would recommend my personal favorite, Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. That is a fun take on the story of Jesus. And it's a very unique thing, and I loved it. I read it multiple times, and at every age you read it and you learn something new because you read it through different perspective, different eyes. Yeah. I really appreciate your invite and the generosity and all the questions. I think you're doing a great thing, and I'm glad that in a way we're doing it together, and we'll continue supporting each other. It's fun.
Absolutely. It was my honor to have you here and to talk with you and hear your story, because I'm sure many of your listeners might not know why you're doing this. What's your back end story? And I hope some of our listeners hop on and listen to your stories and familiarize themselves with other things that immigrants are up to, and all the great stories that you're sharing.
Yeah, definitely.
What was one takeaway you have from this episode? One action you will take because you heard Sasha's story? Whatever it is, make sure you connect with Sasha on her podcast and support her documentary or watch her TED Talk, or even ask your burning question from Ask Your Friendly Russian on TikTok. You can find all of those links in the show notes. As always, thank you for listening and sharing our immigrant stories with your friends, and of course, writing us a review. I love reading your reviews. It helps me to understand what are your needs and how I can improve. You, my audience, mean the world to me, and I know I will have you and your friend in the next episode of Empowering Conversations, where all of us can learn from successful immigrants, one conversation at a time.